Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth Podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Hello, and welcome back to the Wade Borth Podcast. Today, my guest is an old farm boy like myself, and we're going to talk a little bit about his IBC journey. And it's going to be a fun conversation talking about what led him to IBC. We're going to talk a little bit about farming. We're going to talk about difficulties in farming. But more importantly, what changed in his thought process and why in his discovery of IBC, and what kind of brought him down the pathway to discover this, to understand what infinite banking is all about, and really controlling the banking function in your life, and what it looked like when he didn't have control of the banking function, and then also what it looks like now that he started down that pathway, the kind of the hope and the excitement that he's starting to look at now that he's controlling the banking function in his life. So today I'd like to welcome David Hanks. David, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Wade.
You bet. So it's fun having a conversation with another farm boy that gets my quirky conversations about my garden and my farm. So for those that are listening, I grew up on a farm in North Dakota. David, you had a farm down in, where was it at?
West Tennessee.
So what we raised maybe is a little bit different, but it's still the same thought process. And again, my story was I grew up on a farm up until the point to where the banker told my dad that he should drop that life insurance because it was expensive. And then my dad dies 6 months later after the banker tells him to do that. And surprised that he came to the door telling my mom, I can remember this like it was yesterday, that, hey, we're going to call this note and you're going to have to sell all the equipment and you're going to have to sell everything you have, all the grain and everything else you have in storage to pay this note. He was also, think about how crazy that was. He was the one that told my dad to drop the life insurance. And then he was coming knocking at the door collecting because we didn't have any cash. And so I was sharing that story with David, and he kind of shared his story with me, and I'm like, man, it's not a coincidence that we're having this conversation, because your story is kind of similar to that. And for those people that don't know my journey into IBC, mine started really in about 2006, but was really cemented in 2008 and 2009 when I had an opportunity we're going to do an expansion on our house. We're going to do some addition on our house. And had the contractor over there Wednesday of one week, and he said, yeah, we'll be here Wednesday of the next week. We'll start the digging, we'll start doing the addition on your house. And on that next Monday, I got a letter from Wells Fargo that said, hey, your line of credit's been pulled. And I was going to use my line of credit, my home equity line of credit, to fund my addition. And with just a snap of the fingers, a decision from somebody out in wherever the heck Wells Fargo is located, someplace in California probably, that choice of mine was gone. And that my ability to control my destiny and control what I wanted to do was gone. And I had started IBC at that point, but not really in earnest, not really understanding the impact and the power that controlling the banking function of your life can have. So just so you understand that with David, he's going to share with you a little bit of his story and what it looks like, right? So David, right now, you still do a little bit of farming, but you farmed back in 2016 and before that, correct?
Yeah, I've farmed pretty much my whole life. I worked for other farmers when I was younger, and I started on my own in 1999 and had worked up to, I had a small trucking company too as well at the same time. And somewhere along 2002, I quit the trucking company and just focused more on the farming and worked 2,000 acres up till 2016. And
really quick, just for our listeners, some in North Dakota go 2,000 acres. That's not much. You know, some people in Minnesota and maybe Iowa, they go, that's a lot of acres. But how is that compared to down in your neck of the woods? Is that mid-sized average?
No, it's probably, I was one of the smaller farmers in the county.
You're making a living doing it.
Yeah, I was making a decent living doing it. Yeah, it was just me, my wife, and my son. So
Gotcha.
We didn't have employees. Well, there was a year or two I had some employees, but after my son got old enough, wasn't in school, and he could help me. So it was basically a family operation. And we worked a couple thousand acres there. In 2015, we had a really bad year, which that's farming. We've been through it before because you get on your feet, you get stuff paid for, and then you have some bad years, and then you got to borrow money, go to the bank, hawk stuff you've got paid for to keep going, and then you just start the vicious cycle over. It's just over and over. In 2015, We had a pretty bad year. I think we lost $250,000 in 15,
Oh,
which is a ton of money to me. And I actually was considering quitting. Went into the bank, and the banker's telling me, he said, "Man, you're in great shape." I said, "Why do you want to quit?" I said, "You just said it. I'm in great shape. I'm going to quit while I am." And I sat there, and they taught me into signing the papers to renew my production loan. Every year I had to go to the bank and get a production loan. It took about $750,000 a year is what I had to borrow to put my crop in. So every year you had to pay that loan off at the end of your, when you got your crops out, and renew your note to go for the next year. So when I went up there in 15, I was considering quitting just to get out of it, and just kind of tired of the roller coaster ride. And they talked me into going again in 16. So I said, okay. And they did not have a lien on my house at the time. Well, I had lost that $250,000. They said, well, let's just regroup and let us put everything in one pile. Put all your stuff together. And that should have been a red flag. I should have walked out right then. They wound up putting my powder coating business in with it, my home. I got 2 rental houses. Everything got put all in one big lump sum. And my wife and I actually sat out in the parking lot of the bank for probably 30 minutes, contemplating on going back in until I just tear that note up. I'm not going to do it. But we didn't. We came home. We farmed in 16, and I lost twice as much money in 16 as I did 15. We had a bad drought. Replanted my corn crop, I think, 3 times that year. Still didn't make a corn crop. Had a terrible corn crop. I was expecting a rally late that fall in the market, and it never happened. So on top of not making a crop, then I didn't get nothing for the crop. So it was really bad. And I told my wife, I said, the only way we're going to come out of this, we're going to have to farm it. We're going to have to continue to farm because there's so much cash flow involved in farming. And so I go back to the bank that fall, and after we got the crop out in 16, and in less than 5 minutes, that man told me he couldn't help me. Now, This is the same guy that talked me into going the year before when I wanted to quit.
So that's crazy, the fact that they put you in a position, they didn't want half, they wanted it all.
That's right. And to the day I die, I'm going to think, because they didn't have my house previously. And when they talked me into going again, they had everything I owned tied up. And like I said, in 5 minutes in that office that day, he said, I can't help you. And there you are. The bank has just changed your life, man. You can't do anything. Yeah. And I wasn't behind on anything. Everything I had was current. And
it reminds me a little bit about, and I was pretty young when my dad died in 81, but I remember I've researched it enough that I think I remember, but I just remember researching like in Iowa, and the same thing was going on where they go, hey, we're going to wrap up these loans. So you had, your loan was for those pigs you're buying or for the cows or whatever it was. And They go, well, only way we're going to give you a new loan is if we can wrap everything up into it, right? And this was the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And so, no, not to me, but just go on the internet and do some research about where interest rates were at and what was going on. But this was the common practice back in the late 70s, early 80s, is that they would say, well, we'll give you a loan, we'll restructure, we'll actually even decrease some interest rates. Because remember, those are high interest rates times. But they collateralized everything. Up until that point, they just collateralized what you were buying.
Right.
But then at that time, they said, well, we're going to collateralize everything, your operation, your buildings, everything, in order to control all the things that you had versus just that commodity or that cattle or the hogs or whatever you were buying.
Exactly.
And that sounds like that's exactly what they did to you. They wanted to control your rental business, your powder coat business, your buildings, your house, everything. And then, again, you weren't missing payments. This is the part that I think people need to understand. You didn't miss a payment. You were just...
I know, and that was one of the most aggravating things. I guess I didn't think very clearly during some of those times. I was so mad at them that maybe I didn't make rational decisions every day. But I literally went into the bank that January after he told me he couldn't help me. I went into the bank to make my house payment, and they would not accept my house payment. I'm standing there with the money to pay my house payment. And the girl, the teller, she's kind of looking all confused and punching on the computer. And she says, "You're going to have to call somebody." I said, "What do you mean I got to call somebody?" She said, "I can't take your payment." I said, "What do you mean you can't take my payment?" She said, "You need to call whoever you got your loan with." So my brother, fortunately, was vice president of a different bank. And I called my brother. I said, "Hey," I said, "what's going on here?" And I told him the story. He said, "You don't want to know." He said, "They're going to wait 6 months and they're going to foreclose on your house." I said, "They can't do that." I said, "I'm standing here to make the payment. I'm current." I said, He said, "That's in that fine print you don't read." He said, "That's that little bitty words at the bottom of that contract you signed when you done that note that you didn't read." And he was right. They tried to take my house. So that was a pretty long, hard battle, but I managed to keep my house, my powder coating business, and the rental property. I managed to keep everything and kept 2 of the farms I owned. But, it's almost like it was their angle in the beginning. I don't understand. I didn't understand why it did, but that's what provoked me to start trying to figure out a different way. And I read the book, What Would the Rockefellers Do? And that kind of got me to thinking about different ways to finance everything and do away with the bank.
Yeah.
And so I went and talked to my insurance agent and talked to him about I had a life insurance policy I had for several years and had some cash value in it. And I talked to him about borrowing money from my insurance policy. He said, "You can't do that." And from what I had read, I'm like, yeah, I think I can, but I didn't want to argue with him. I've been doing business there now for 40 years. So I left, and I guess it was probably another couple of years when my son talked to Teresa at Factum, and Brandon got to read, he read Nelson's book on becoming your own banker, and Brandon come to me, and he said, "Dad, you need to revisit this." He said, it is something to it. He said, "I don't know what your insurance agent's talking about, but you need to look at this again." So then I read the book, and like I said, ever since then, it's just a life-changing way and it's not a get-rich-quick scheme. A lot of people think it's some kind of scam, or it's not. You get out of it what you put in it. You got to be dedicated to it, and the more you put in it, the more you get out of it.
That's actually in the introduction to Nelson's book. I would encourage anybody that's listening to. If you've read Nelson's book, go back and read the introduction. He says quite the contrary. He says this is not a get-rich-quick scheme. To the contrary, it is a lifetime process that you have to go through in order to take control of the banking function in your life. And it's not about the numbers. And we hear this all the time. It's not about the numbers. Eventually, it will be about the numbers. But I'm going to take you back to the day when the guy gave you 5 minutes, told you he couldn't help you. What was your emotion? Just take me back emotionally what you were going through.
Oh, it was bad. I was pretty mad. I was mad enough to the point where I just got up and walked out of the bank. I didn't say nothing to him. I was mad enough to reach across that desk and just let him have it. Because, how do you go from running my gross income at that time was over $1 million. So right. I just, in 5 minutes time, went from $1 million operation to I can't help you because of one man's decision. And I don't even know how to describe my emotions. I was so, like I said, I didn't think very rational there. I was mad about everything and how it went down. It's not like we weren't working and trying to make it, but I don't know. I really can't describe them other than I was furious.
And I'd imagine it was the stress of foreclosure, the stress of debt. There's a lot of research on this, and it's pretty interesting. And it's interesting, but it's bad, right? The sense that increased stress is a killer. And I mean literally a killer, because people die because of that increased stress, right?
That's right.
And I can imagine you must not have been feeling as well as being emotionally and mentally just destroyed.
Right. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I didn't go through that with my issue. I tell people, I remember the letter. I see the letter. I remember the day it came in the mailbox. Those are life-changing events in your day. I would imagine, you probably can see this banker's desk, and you probably see what his hair color very vividly.
I can still see his face plain as day. the way he looked at me that day. It wasn't even the loan officer that come in and told me that. The loan officer wasn't really the one that taught me into going the previous year. His boss, the manager over the ag division of the bank, is the one that taught me into going again in 16 for some reason. And the day that at the end of 16, he was the one that come in there and told me. He said, I can't help you. You know, looking back, like I said, I was so mad about it. And then, like you said, a lot of emotions go through your mind at that point. Because we had worked really hard. My family did not farm. And if you know what the price of farm equipment is, and you know how difficult it is to come from nothing and farm. I lived in a one-bedroom house, trucking. Had an old pickup truck when I started. That's it. I didn't have nothing. And I started the trucking and started the farming, and I had worked really hard for the past nearly 20 years to get to where I was. And then, like I said, in 5 minutes, I got the carpet yanked out from under me.
Oh, man.
And
what's your quick takeaway lesson from that? What would be the lesson you'd like the listeners to hear from that? Who's in charge?
Oh, the bank was in charge then, and you need to fix that, because I don't care who you are. If you're in good financial shape and really don't need a bank, oh yeah, they're glad to help you. But when you really need them, that's when they don't want to help you. They're not going to do anything that's of any risk to them. They're going to make sure they got plenty of collateral. And what's those saying? They say you don't need an umbrella if it's not raining or something like that. I forget.
They're always willing to lend you an umbrella when the sun shines. As soon as it's going to take them away. Yeah.
And that's the way I look at a bank, man. They just, if you're in good financial shape, you're their best friend. If you're struggling, they don't want to talk to you.
And to that point, I've run across clients that would agree with you 100%. And they go, that's why I'm always going to pay cash for everything I do. And I have a story. I'm like, well, understand that if you have cash, then you almost have to think like a bank, right? It goes back to Garrett Gunderson's What Would the Rockefellers Do? It's a great book. And it's like, they had money. So they said, we're going to apply some of the, and I'm going to call them banking principles, because what the bank did to you that's their business, but it's not the banking function. Does that make sense?
Right, yes.
So understanding the banking function, having control of it, because a bank, whatever it lends out, it expects to get back with principal and interest. Right. And so if we have cash, you're talking about the banks being awful, but I think sometimes individually we can be as awful to ourselves as the bank is to us, because we have an asset that we put to work for ourselves. We take our most valuable assets, or one of our most valuable assets, which is our cash, we put it to work, and then we don't have it paid back. We don't treat it with respect. And it takes a lot of time and effort to get that money.
Yes, and that is something that never really dawned on me until I read Nelson's book. Because I had that thought, if I pay cash for everything, I won't have to deal with this. But then you're giving up the interest you could earn from your cash. So yes, exactly. And
you're also giving up that pool of money, right? You've taken from your pool of money to use to run for operations. So think about it from the standpoint: if you need $1 million operating loan, you borrow $1 million from your insurance company, and you don't pay it back, then what are you going to borrow next year?
Right.
Now, if you have a shortfall like you did, then you can make adjustments. You're the one that's in control.
That's exactly right. And boy, I can't tell you how many times I have said, if I had known in 1999 what I know now, I would have never been in that position. You'd had to double down and work your way through it. But
so think about if I would have approached you in 1999 with this idea, or let's make it 2001. I think that's when Nelson wrote his book. Okay. If I'd approached you with this idea in 2001, tell me what you would have thought.
Honestly, at first, I probably would have thought you'd done lost your mind, to be honest.
They're not, but I think that are thinking the same way. And that's why I want your perspective, because you're brand new in this journey. And that's why it's so exciting for me to talk to you, is because you're brand new down this IBC journey. But I want you to take you back to 2001. And you said I lost my mind. But why do you think people think that? Is it because they've been conditioned to think that? Or the bank has them brainwashed to think that?
Exactly. When I read What Would the Rockefellers Do, like I said, that's what was my turning point when I get to thinking, okay, there are a lot of wealthy people in this world. How did they get to where they're at? And if I'm not mistaken, it's been a long time since I read that book, but that's what they done, is it not? The
It's
Rockefeller?
exactly what they done.
Okay.
They took, and everybody that's born into that family, they they maximize the policies that are owned on them, and it's paid for by previous death benefits. But then if they want a project, if they're gonna go do something, now again, the Rockefellers are much bigger than you and I are combined are probably ever going to be, right?
Oh, yeah.
But the point is, we can still take. There's the old adage that success leaves clues. Let's take a look at what they were doing.
Right.
So if one of the Rockefellers in the family comes up to and says, "Hey, I want to start a new business," they'd borrow the money from the family, and then they'd have to pay back the principal interest, or they wouldn't have access to that same pool of money.
Exactly.
And that's respecting your money. Where we've been conditioned to think to consume our money versus
Exactly.
respecting it.
Right.
And if you listen to some of my previous podcasts, I have actually one of my favorite podcasts and even blogs is we have to love ourselves and our family more than we love Wells Fargo. And
Yeah, and
that's
I remember when you said that's one thing, Brandon, that has stuck with my son. He said that's one of the things he uses when he talks to people about the infinite banking concept. He said,
yeah.
well, do you love the bank more than you love your family? Cool. So he's done stole that one from you. You're going to have to ask him about that.
I'm all about sharing and giving, man. I'm a go-giver, so I want
Right.
just to give value. But it's so true because I've almost had guys want to get in a fist fight with me when I tell them that I don't literally mean that they love Wells Fargo, but what you do with your money is very important to
Yes.
you. So if we look at what we spend our money on, will tell us what's important, right? I love spending money taking my son on hunting trips and having him play basketball. Those are all things I love to spend my money on because it brings him enjoyment and brings us closer together before he graduates and goes off into the world.
Right.
And so from that standpoint, when we put our money to work and then we're not paying back with principal and interest, do we not like our family banking system? Because we all have a family banking system. Now we have to understand that we all have a family banking system.
You know, I said if you had approached me in 2001, I might have thought you were crazy. Sometimes I think people have to go through something as dramatic as what I did to get your head out of the sand. Yeah, things were going good. I could call up my banker, hey, man, I need this piece of equipment. It's $200,000. And he's like, okay, just write the check and come see me. It was that easy. But when they cut you off and you don't have that, then you're thinking, okay, well, I got to figure out something different. It's just that when things are going well in your life, you don't think about needing to change anything. And so many people today that they just don't think they need to change anything. And they could be so much better off if they would just look at this.
And I have people ask me a lot of times. They go, "Hey, who's a perfect client for this?" I go, "Really, the perfect client is that person that's willing to learn, that has an
Exactly.
open mind. If you don't have an open mind, no matter who you are, then quite frankly, you're not a client of mine. You're never going to be a client of mine because what can I teach you that you don't already know?"
Right. And one thing I've learned no longer than I have been doing it is don't ever judge someone and try to think which ones will do it and which ones will not do it because you're going to lose that battle.
Absolutely.
Today is today to pay your income tax. Okay, it's the deadlines today. So I had to go by my CPA's office earlier today. And of all the people, I never would have thought I had actually sent her the link, the red pill page. And she came out of her, I don't ever see her hardly. Well, she comes out of her office and starts asking me questions about it today.
Wow, on tax filing day.
Yes. And
Well, you
yeah.
never see CPA come out of the office on tax filing day.
No. And I'm like, wow. So, and she's got a lot of clients that could utilize it. So
Yeah.
she would be a great contact.
And it's one of those things too, David. Again, people that have money understand this.
Right. That's true.
And actually, I find that CPAs are sometimes, or people that understand or work with wealthier clients, they look at what their wealthier clients are doing. And a lot of their wealthy clients are doing exactly what we're talking about. And we hear this all the time that, wow, this is so great. Why isn't everybody else doing it? They are. They're just not advertising.
That's right.
I
That's right.
mean,
That have got wealth of doing it. That's for sure.
yeah. And so I guess that's the point I would leave to all the listeners and anybody that's thinking about calling David up and reaching out to David to work with him. Because your story is the quintessential story of taking control. Because if you're not in control of the banking function, who is?
That's right. That's exactly right.
And then when does it rain? It's going to rain when you don't have an umbrella.
Exactly. Exactly. Sometimes that's what it takes to wake you up.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple ways to learn. You can learn from my mistakes, or you can learn from your own mistakes.
Right. Exactly.
And the wise man is like, I'm going to learn from somebody else's mistakes, right? I mean, we're all going to experience that ourselves. We have to go through that because when none of us are wired enough to go, hey, your mistake's going to happen to me. But if
Right.
they take a little bit of that and go, let's hear more about this, and then put me in a position to say, well, what if the worst possible thing happens and the banker tells me that I can't farm or whatever it might be? Do you have a
Right.
fallback position? Having just one place to go get money is not a choice.
That's right. That's right.
And so creating your own family banking function is really what we're talking about. And it has nothing to do with rate of return or anything else. It's about control. And then
Exactly.
if you're not in control, somebody else is in control of you. It's probably as simple as that.
And they can control everything you have.
Yeah, that story. That's the part that you didn't share with me is the fact that they wrapped your businesses and your house and everything into that debt.
And my
They
wife,
attached everything, didn't they?
if my wife listens to this, she'll be mad at me for that. So she don't like to talk about it, nor what I do.
No, I meant that. I was going to bring that back up. You were talking about the hopelessness you were feeling at that time, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
It had to be tremendous hopelessness.
Thankfully, those were a couple of tough years to go. That was a huge adjustment. Matter of fact, another good friend of mine, he was a banker as well, and he told me, he said, "There's no way you can pay for your house and just." He said, "You got to pay them off." And anyway, short version of that story is, my son come and run the powder coating shop for me. I think he worked. I know he worked for 1 year without a paycheck. He was still living at home, and I actually got in a big truck there for a little over a year, maybe a year and a half. And with him running the powder coating business, and I stayed gone a lot in the truck, just to kind of get through them first 2 years. And once we kind of got things back, got our feet back under us, and I come back to the powder coating shop then. So
So
it
you
gets
drove your
better.
way out of debt.
Oh yeah, well, I'm working on it. I got a long way to go, but I'm working on it. This right here is going to help a lot. I can tell you that.
So Dave, just because we talked emotion going into that when that happened, what are you feeling now? When you started implementing this whole idea of taking control of the banking function of your life, what kind of emotion does that bring out of you as well? Is it
It
like
gives it gives me drive, man. It when somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm going to do it. If it just gives me drive to prove that no, I can do this. It's similar to when I started farming. Everybody said you can't start. Your family didn't farm. You can't do that. It's not possible. Well, I did it for 20 years, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to come back stronger, and I'm going to do it through infinite banking.
giving you a sense of freedom that you probably have never experienced being in control of
Exactly.
function?
Exactly.
So
That's my goal.
that's good. And I want to touch on one other thing that you brought up too. You mentioned it in passing, but I want to bring it back up. You went to your current life insurance agent, and he says you can't do that. You can't borrow against your policy. I think there's a great lesson there that, if you don't mind, I want to touch on.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that he's a good old boy, right?
Yeah. Oh, we're
He's
pretty good
probably
friends, honestly. Yeah.
yeah. But the point is, and I've heard this. I've had a lot of guys go, I can do infinite banking. A lot of agents go, I can do infinite banking, but they don't know what it is. They've never studied it. They've never decided to become a practitioner. And one of the things that I'm trying to mentor agents and I'm trying to mentor my clients in understanding is that this is all we do,
Right.
right? So this is our calling. This is what we do. And we just happen to use, it's that idea of that we want to control the banking function in our lives, right? Nelson talked about the problem being that your money, your capital resides in somebody else's bank and they're getting rich off it because they understand the banking function. You don't, so they're taking control of it. But
That's
if you
right.
want to take control of it and you have a process, when you go back and look at Bank of America or Wells Fargo, I'll pick on Wells Fargo. They have $20 billion. That's with a B of properly structured life insurance. And all we're doing is saying, do what the Rockefellers do, and which is they have a ton of that properly structured life insurance as well. And that's what we're using.
Right.
And so I guess my point being, your insurance guy might be a great guy, but we're not talking about insurance. We're talking about banking and the banking process in your life and the
Right.
family banking system. We happen to use properly structured, but it's the product that's probably the least important part of the conversation. We have to use the tool, but it's like any other craftsman. Let's talk power coding. I probably could come down to your shop. I probably could figure out how to turn on the powder coater, but I wouldn't have a clue what I'm doing because I don't have. I mean, I can get the tools and the equipment, I can get the product, but I don't have a clue what I'm doing with it. You're a craftsman with that, right?
Right.
So make sure that whoever you're working with, I would encourage anybody that knows David, if David shared this with you, talk to David because he's been down there. He's been through the crucible, right?
Yep.
And so your approach and your thoughts process about it is huge. Anybody on my side listening to me, think about what this conversation has been, right? Somebody was controlling David. You didn't know it until the point that they kind of exerted their power and said, okay, now you're out.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you kind of realize real quickly who's in charge.
Exactly. Yeah, I just thought I was the boss.
I mean, that's good for us married guys to think that we're the boss every once in a while. At least our spouse is the boss.
Well, my wife's not listening, so I can say that right now.
Well, David, I appreciate you sharing your story because that is so powerful, and people need to hear this, and people need to understand that if they're not controlling the function of that banking function in life, who is? Ask that question, who is? And if
Exactly.
it's not them, then they're not really in charge of their business.
No, they're not.
So, and again, I'm not just speaking out of turn. I'm talking to a guy that found that out the hard way, unfortunately.
Well, and like I said, that's the way a lot of us have to learn, and it really took that. I don't think I would have ever dug this deep if it hadn't happened to me. And it's sad to say that, but talking with some farmers here since I have been doing this, I see them being who I was
Yep.
7, 8 years ago, and they don't want to listen to it. They'll eventually get it, maybe.
Yeah. Hopefully, they don't learn it too hard. I mean, and that's probably the frustrating part about it so much is that when times are good, you just put some away. I mean, while we're
Right.
talking about savings and where we're going to save it is this happens to be properly structured life insurance. So we're just putting some away. It's the old adage, you go back to the Bible, right? You store when times are good, and then
Right.
so when times aren't so good, then you can have access to it.
That's right. And
So,
some people don't seem to grasp the aspect that, and I think I've heard Teresa use this analogy, but your money's not gone. It's like when they make a deposit into their policy, it's not gone. They act like they can't get it back. And I've even had some people say, "Well, I'm doing that," and they said, "But I can only borrow 10% of what I've put in it." I said, "Well, you don't have a properly structured policy if you can only get 10%."
no, I 100% agree. They're not in the right type of contract or the right structure, and that's the sad part about it is that's what people think. And again, I'll go back to your agent, right? He's a good old boy, I'm sure he is, but he was telling you something that just wasn't true. Not
Right.
that he was trying to deceive you. I just
Right.
don't think he knew.
Probably didn't. And like I said, that policy still, I took my money out, so it's not near as good of a situation. So as soon as I can get that paid off, I'm gonna move that one. So
Yeah, we'll see what happens in the future, but it's one of those things like you said. It's not the tool; it's the craftsman
yes, that's right.
that's wielding the tool. And I think that's probably the real key is finding somebody that can empower you to take control of the banking function. I will tell this to everybody. I'll tell it to you, David. I'll tell it to your listeners that you share this with. Is not my job. It's not David's job for us to become your banker. It's to empower you to become your own banker.
Exactly.
We don't want to be gatekeepers to anybody being successful. We just want to be there to empower you to be as strong as you possibly can be, right? So I'll leave it with this, but I'm going to take it back to I love to garden because that's what we have left of farming, and I love to garden. And so part of what I do, and I kind of look at this as my calling, is I think about growing beans in my garden and tomatoes and everything else. Those are the things I want to nurture and grow and have be very fruitful. And just like in my life, there's some certain things I want to be very fruitful. And part of my job by empowering you is going through and taking out the weeds, getting rid of a lot of the weeds. The noise that's out there in the community right now is tremendous. There's a lot of weeds, and my job is just to go there and help clean the weeds out of your field and out of your garden, so you can grow and nurture those things you want to grow and nurture.
Right. There you
So,
go. That's a
but
good way to put it.
well, David, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your willingness to share your story. I hope anybody that's listening to this will have a conversation because we're not about selling. It's just about education. It's about having a conversation so we can start to think differently. I mean, how do we save the farming community as a whole, or even small business or any business as it is, unless we're willing to have just a conversation, an honest conversation, and be open minded about different ideas because again, this idea that we're talking about isn't brand new. It's been around a very long time.
Right.
It's just that those that have wealth, they don't spread it around. They keep it themselves and they keep getting wealthier.
Yep,
So,
that's right.
all righty, sir. Well, I appreciate your time, and we'll obviously have future conversations because we want to kind of log this journey because you're just starting down the path, and I'm looking forward to having future conversations with you.
Me too, Wade. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, you take care, sir.
Thank you. You too.
If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.